Tēnā tātou katoa, e hui nei tēnei wā. Welcome to the third of our webinars on teaching high quality physical education. My name is Alan Ovens and I'm the discipline leader of the Sport, Health and Physical Education area at the University of Auckland. This is the third in a series of 4 webinars that we've been hosting each Thursday throughout August. No doubt if you've enrolled in this one, you've seen the others. But I just want to remind you that next week, which is our last webinar, I'll be presenting alongside Marissa Mackay from Physical Education New Zealand, and we'll focus on making games educational. And particularly, we'll focus in on the Move Well resource, which is a resource that was circulated to all New Zealand schools last year. And I'm sure across these webinars, there's been quite a lot of ideas that you can use to help plan and deliver high quality physical education and health programs in your schools. Just before I introduce Rod, I would like to outline just a couple of guidelines for the webinar. Firstly, please feel free to put any of the questions that you may have in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. We'll save those till the end of the presentation. So we're trying to leave around about 20 minutes at the end to get into a discussion. And if those questions are there, I'll pose them to Rod and he'll be able to answer those. And if you want to follow up anything from the webinar today, we are recording the presentation and then we will email you the link to the presentation afterwards. And please feel free, if you want to follow up anything in an email or something like that, please contact us. So now it's my pleasure, very great pleasure, to introduce Dr. Rod Philpot. Rod is a senior lecturer in health and physical education in the School of Curriculum Pedagogy at the University of Auckland. He's currently the program leader of the Bachelor of Sport, Health and Physical Education and has been part of an international research collaboration known as EduHealth, which is focused on social justice in health and PE with colleagues from the United States, United Kingdom, Norway, and Sweden. Rod has a background in teaching health and physical education with some 16 years of teaching in Auckland secondary schools. So welcome, Rod, and I'll pass it over to you.
Kia ora, thank you, Al, and welcome everyone and on this wonderful Auckland day. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa, ko Rod Philpot toko ingoa. As Alan stated, I'm the program leader of the Bachelor of Sport, Health and Physical Education. So I'll just talk a little bit about myself before I move into the seminar itself. Becoming a JEDI master. I'm originally from Canada. I came here in 1991, so do the maths, it's quite a long time ago. Spent quite a few years teaching in Auckland secondary schools, although my first few jobs, short-term positions, were in primary schools. But I've spent probably half of my work life working in secondary schools, Linfield College, Oneonga High School, Mount Roscoe Grammar School, and Rosehill College. So and loved every minute of my teaching life. The last 10 or 12 years I've been working at the University of Auckland, as Alan indicated. I've been, I guess, going back a little bit when I completed my PhD, it was focused on teaching for social justice and what we call critical pedagogy within our Bachelor of Physical Education program. And more recently, 2 collaborations with overseas colleagues, which have been just absolutely enlightening. And most of my research now is on critical pedagogy and social justice in health and physical education. The presentation will focus on pedagogy. It'll focus on what teachers can do in the classrooms to influence learning. There's 4 sections. Most of the presentation will focus on the last section, that is pedagogies for social justice. But I'll start with talking about what JEDI is, and sorry to those Star Wars enthusiasts, it's nothing to do with Star Wars. We've taken this idea from one of my postgrad students, actually, Mitchell, who talked about this acronym being used, and we've adopted it for this presentation. I'll talk about why teaching for social justice, some of the aims of teaching for social justice, and I'll talk about why JEDI. So they're the 4 sections that we're going to go through today. Before I do that, though, I just want to talk a little bit, as Alan alluded to, about some of the backgrounds of this presentation. The presentation draws on a number of projects, starting with my PhD, moving on to a supervision of James McIntyre, who is looking at how teachers realize the potential, the socially critical potential of the health and PE curriculum. It also draws a little bit on Aaron Scoringe's master's, who looked similarly at teaching for social justice and health and PE, and how physical education and health teachers in New Zealand did that. And then more recently, Joran Jerdien and Wayne Smith led a project where they interviewed teachers to understand what critical pedagogy and what teaching for social justice meant. Most of the presentation, however, draws on the project that's on the screen now. It was a project between 3 universities: Linnaeus University in Sweden, Inland Norway University of Applied Science in Norway, and the University of Auckland. What we did over this 3-year study is we had the privilege of spending time in classrooms, and we observed teachers and we interviewed teachers. And what we were looking for is critical incidents of teaching for social justice. And at times we had to ask the teacher what they were doing and why they were doing it, and they explained it to us. So what we're going to present today draws on those. I have to give special acknowledgement to Wayne Smith, a former colleague who's recently retired, and he played an absolutely critical role in defining these 9 pedagogies that I will mention shortly. So what is JEDI? I'm sure you figured out by now that JEDI is an acronym. The acronym is for Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. So justice is really about fairness, and there's lots of literature on justice and what justice means beyond the scope of this presentation. But justice is very much about fairness. But we need to think about who decides what is fair and for whom. Equity is often juxtaposed against equality, and the aim, I guess, for us in teaching is equality of outcome. But, and I guess this is my first bold statement, to achieve this, one of the things that educators need to do is they need to unequally distribute resources in order to achieve these equal outcomes. And the resources might be time, it might be capital, a number of things that will help students to achieve. Diversity is any dimension that can be used to differentiate groups, and teaching for diversity often requires one to reflect on oneself as a teacher and what they know and what they don't know. And part of teaching for the diversity is learning more about yourself and more about other groups. And inclusion, a culture in which people can feel comfortable and confident to be themselves. And again, we need to reflect on who is included, who is excluded, who has opportunities, who doesn't, and who makes decisions. And so the questions are, and I ask you to think about these during the presentation, is how can we teach for justice, equity, inclusion, and diversity in health and physical education? Now, it's a funny time to summarize, but I've narrowed the aims of teaching for social justice, or teaching for justice, equity, diversity, inclusion, down to 3 principal positions or aims. And the first thing we need to do is to provide individual students with a better experience in school or health and physical education within the existing structures. And I say that because there are structures within society that we can't easily change. And there are students that will be working through these structures. And currently we have a society impacted by COVID, where certainly last year, many students were working online. And we try to do the best we can within these existing structures. And that's one of the first aims of teaching for social justice. The second aim is to challenge the structures that restrict students' opportunities and or outcomes. In other words, taking action. So in addition to working within those structures, we also need to challenge the structures. And those structures might be at a school level or at a department level. In other words, the units of work that you're working within. It might be some of the rules around uniform. It might be some of the structures within the school around funding, those sorts of things. So it's about challenging those structures in addition to working within them. The third part is actually to empower students themselves to take actions on structures that restrict opportunities. So one of the things we want to accomplish when we teach for social justice is to help students take control within their own lives, both within school and when they leave school, so that they can take action themselves once they leave our classrooms. So why justice, equity, diversity, inclusion? The main reason is that inequity and social exclusion impact negatively on a wide range of measures of well-being. So in a sense, teaching for JEDI and social justice is about student well-being. The second reason is that education as a whole can do more to provide students with more equitable opportunities and outcomes. And I know it's a really easy thing to say, but when we reflect on ourselves, we can typically do something else to help students, and both within the structures that exist, but also to change some of those structures. The third point is that health and physical education is uniquely positioned within New Zealand, the curriculum, to help with well-being. It has an explicit aim on well-being for the tamariki of Aotearoa. And the fourth reason is that there's been a real strong push for social justice within Health and PE for a long, long time. There's been a strong vision. There's been a lot of work that advocates for social justice. But in terms of what we actually do in the classroom, there is far less available. So one of the reasons for this project was very much to understand what good teaching looks like in classrooms by watching teachers. And so that's what we did across this project. In what follows, I will present 9 approaches or pedagogies or strategies that we believe are the types of practices that advocate for and promote social justice. They will be presented individually, and they will be followed by examples. And the examples, as I said earlier, are generated from observations of teachers and interviews with teachers. So they're examples that are actually happening in practice. Before I talk about them, I guess it's important to recognize that all of these were done in practical physical education context. So for the purposes of this study, we didn't study any classroom, any health classrooms, any small classrooms, because within Norway and Sweden, those sort of structures don't exist. It's PEH, physical education for health, or PE, or in our case, health and PE. But all of the things we observed were within the practical context of gyms and courts and swimming pools and fields. But I think you will find that some of these you can transfer to any environments. So let's get started. And so some of the questions I have for you as you observe some of these are, do these pedagogies resonate with your thoughts on good practice? What can be added? What is missing? And I would be really interested to hear your thoughts on that. So the first approach is a pedagogy of care. And a pedagogy of care are teachers' actions that show they generally care about the inclusion of students. These actions include taking caring actions, which can include planning and what we've called doing the little things to show students they care. The little things are knowing the students. They're seeing each student, seeing them as individuals. It's knowing names, it's listening, it's using humor, it's engaging and talking with students when they arrive. One of the ways of thinking about that, when I was a young teacher, someone said it's every time you have a conversation with a student, it's like putting money in the bank. And if you invest in the students, if you put money in the bank, if you ever have to make a withdrawal, if there's ever an incident where you're not positive with them, at least you've made a big deposit, so it balances out in the end. And I think that's quite a nice thought. One of the teachers talked about, we played a really boring game at the start of the year, but it was perfect because now I know all the names and it makes a big difference. In Sweden, one of the teachers met the students in the center of the gym and they welcomed everybody to the gym. And this was appropriate where the teacher gave many of the students a hug. And we're not suggesting that's appropriate everywhere, but it certainly was in Sweden. And one of the teachers said to us, it's important to know the students. I want them to all be comfortable. I always try and avoid people feeling like they are exposed. And that's a translation, but there's a real focus on pedagogies of care from all of the teachers that we worked with. The second pedagogy is a pedagogy of understanding. And it begins when teachers take action to get to know their students and their individual circumstances. It's about treating individual students differently because of their different circumstances and needs. And I've got 3 examples of that. And the first example was students who were late to class. We observed a class in Norway where a few of the students arrived late and the teacher talked to them briefly and let them join the class. And when we talked to that teacher later, he explained to us that many of the students have mopeds or scooters or bikes, and they're able to get to the lessons quickly because the fields were quite a long way away, whereas other students didn't, and these were the students that were late. And he just thought it was completely unfair to expect them to be late, and he didn't penalize them. And we saw that in a number of circumstances. We also saw questions about uniform, not questions about uniform, but awareness of the cost of uniforms, different medical conditions of students, religious beliefs. And one of the teachers said to us that, first and foremost, I want them to participate. The uniform is something we can have conversations about later. So uniform was seen to be something that we don't want to make an issue of it. We understand that students have different needs, and so students were included as best they could. And engagement. There was an example in Sweden where there was a new immigrant student. So Sweden, just to give a bit of context, had about 300,000 immigrants, and it was really a unique challenge at that time. And there was a student who was an immigrant who had no background in swimming, and the student spent a bit of time in the pool and then left. The teacher talked to that student, didn't expect the student to hop back in the water immediately, didn't tell them off. Basically, when we talked to them later, she said that she knows that the student isn't too confident. She accepted that she needed to understand that student and she needed to treat them differently. The third pedagogy is a pedagogy of inclusion, I beg your pardon. Focus on taking steps to include all students, and it requires teachers to recognize and address the reasons for non-inclusion. So some of the examples we had, the teachers sat the students on a floor, and they discussed the objectives of the lessons and the nature of the games we're playing, and they allowed everybody to be involved in those discussions. The teachers, and we saw this on many occasions, they paired new students with others in the class, and they told us later that they did it for the reason that these were students that weren't so confident at being included, and they made an effort to include them. The teachers designed transitions between lessons, and again, this was done very cleverly. So if they had groups of 2, they went to groups of 4, as opposed to having to change the groups again. So once students were paired up, they joined a bigger group and they were all included. The teachers jumped in and jumped out of games. So if they were finding some students weren't being included, they actually jumped in the game, played, included the students that maybe weren't being included, and then they jumped out of the game. The teachers also provided more time with students who needed it most. And again, there was a school in New Zealand where one of the teachers spent quite a bit of time with one individual student. And he explained to us later that there was a very good reason for that. This student could become a problem, and he knew he needed to spend more time with him. Another example is differentiating activities. One of the lessons we saw, it was based around fitness, and the students were asked to design activities with 3 different levels, so that everybody, when they did the activity of the one group of students, had 3 choices of how to do the activity, so everybody could be involved in it. So pedagogies of inclusion, again, are examples of the sorts of pedagogies that we saw some of the good teachers doing. We saw pedagogies that build relationships, and a quote from one of the teachers, "I find it almost impossible to teach if I don't have a relationship with the students." And some of the things they did was taking time to talk one-on-one with the students. We saw examples of really well-planned lessons. We saw examples of lessons that were explicitly about working together and building relationships. We saw name games. We saw adventure-based learning, I guess, would be one of the main things we saw, where teachers purposely put students in groups. They purposely asked students to work with each other and learn about each other through those activities. So there's a real focus on building relationships. The fifth category, I beg your pardon, I think it's the 5th category, was pedagogies that foster reciprocal respect. And one of the things we noticed, we saw 12 teachers, and without exception, all of the teachers seemed to speak quietly but assertively at times with the students. There was no yelling. There was no public confrontation. In Europe, it seemed almost kind of an informal relationship with the students. And we came to the conclusion that if the teacher is respectful to the students and sets a standard for the students, that the students will return that respect in kind. And it is very much a shift from authoritarian class control. In a sense, the teacher provides a role model for the students of the sort of relationships that are respectful in society. And it was really clear that the teachers we saw did that. They respected the students and the students respected them back. And clearly, when we are only seeing a single lesson, we don't see how those relationships were built. We only see what's happening at the time, but clearly some of the things I've mentioned before were probably happening in the background. And one of the teachers said, and this sort of summarized it, I think when someone is positive to you, you are inclined to be positive yourself, as you feel you have done something well and it sets the tone for the class. At this point, I will pause because when we were writing up these pedagogies, we had a conversation, and the conversation was something like this. Are these 5 pedagogies the foundations for social justice? Are they the foundations for justice, equity, diversity, inclusion? Or are they foundational pedagogies? By foundations, the argument was that if we do these things really well, we've set the scene really nicely for teaching for social justice. And in a sense, as we go back to the start, the 5 pedagogies we've talked about are very much about working with the students within the existing conditions. They're very much a humanist pedagogy, where we show that we work with the students to help them excel and do as well as they can within the circumstances that we've got. But we decided that these were foundational social justice pedagogies. They were foundational in the sense that they were very much about justice. They were very much about equity. They were very much about including diverse students, and they were very much about inclusion. So we've decided that these are very much foundational social justice pedagogies. Moving on, democratic pedagogies was the 6th category, and we decided that this was about power sharing. It begins by recognizing that all students have a democratic right to be involved in decision making. It's a pedagogical approach where both the teachers and the students have a say, and the say could be in a number of things. And we saw conversations about game rules, we saw conversations about content, we saw conversations about teams. One of the little things that we saw a number of the teachers do was simply to get down to the level of the students. And the teachers talked about that breaking down power barriers by sitting down with the students. They were at the same level of them. The other thing that was really explicit in Norway and Sweden was the fact that there was no power dressing by the teachers or by the principals. The standard school uniform was for the teachers and the principals, and everyone was simply a pair of jeans and a t-shirt. And the idea was that we may be the teacher, but we don't have to define ourselves by how we look in terms of looking like we're above you. We saw lots of co-designing of games, of curriculum and content. We saw students choosing activities. So at one school, the lesson ended by the students choosing what the next activity would be. We had one lesson where we saw someone cheating, and we were kind of unsure why the teacher wasn't doing anything about it. But the teacher said that she didn't respond, but afterwards she said, how did you feel about cheating? How did it affect the game? And what shall we collectively do it before the next game? So in other words, she gave the students the opportunity to decide what to do. There is a large body of literature on democratic pedagogies. Kim Oliver in particular talks about activist pedagogies. So there are different words for some of these things. And Oliver's work is very much about giving students choices about activities, choosing assessments, and even choosing uniforms. So there is quite a body of literature talking about how democratic pedagogies can be used. Pedagogies for social cohesion. And I guess the first thing is that the interactive movement-based context of health and PE offer really an excellent opportunity for building social cohesion. And I guess it is particularly good because it can also do the opposite. It's a great opportunity to be really inclusive, and it's a great opportunity for kids to be excluded. And obviously we want the former. So teaching for social cohesion requires teachers to proactively address the nature of the interactions between individuals. Teachers need to use heterogeneous groups. And the essential element for social cohesion is recognizing and accepting differences. So this isn't a lesson. This is almost a philosophy on teaching. So it's something that has to be done over a long, long time. It's not just a temporary bit of cooperation. So what we saw planning. We saw teachers that were holding up cards at the start of the lesson saying, this lesson is about collaboration, and proceeding to do a number of activities focused on collaboration. We saw lesson learning outcomes where the learning outcome was really explicit. It was about building social responsibility and social cohesion. We saw groupings where teachers very cleverly used heterogeneous groups to try to get students to work with other students. And we saw group processing. So we saw, as I return to that ABL example and teaching games examples, opportunities for teachers to actually talk in conversations and really make decisions together and learn about each other through that. So that was one of the key things. And I guess another bold statement is that, has teaching for social cohesion ever been more important than it is right now? And I think now is the time where this could be a really important focus in our health and PE programs. Linked to that is culturally relevant pedagogies. And the simple definition is culturally responsive teaching is teaching that makes sense to the students who are not assimilated into the dominant culture. It requires teachers to adapt their lessons to cater to individual needs. And some of the things we saw is teachers using students' first languages, drawing on Indigenous knowledges, and acknowledging cultural identities. And so one example from New Zealand is where a teacher used Te Reo Māori in a chart on the whiteboard. He used the expression, he mahi tahi tato mo te oranga o te katoa. We should all work together for the well-being of everybody. We saw another example where a teacher took, they took the levels of responsibility, Helson's levels, and converted them to Reo Māori. And they used that to get the students to work cooperatively. We had a teacher who talked about in Sweden, he talked about in Sweden, it's compulsory for all students to swim 200 meters. We have a lot of new immigrant Muslim students who don't want to swim with the boys. So what they did is they talked to the imam in the community, and they found a place where the girls could have extra swimming, and they provided more opportunities for those girls to swim. So the teacher acknowledged that he had little understanding of the culture. He spoke to the imam, he developed an understanding, and he made a change to his practice. So culturally relevant pedagogies is the second to last approach. And the last approach is explicit pedagogy for social justice. The languaging of this perhaps could be critical pedagogies or socially critical pedagogies. And what they actively try to do is address social justice as the learning outcome or the content of the lesson. So this is done in a couple of ways. One of the ways is simply by teachers being critically reflective on themselves. And we had a number of examples of that. Teaching students to be critically reflective. We saw one of the teachers use the movie Bend It Like Beckham to talk about gender stereotypes. We saw a teacher using playground games to get students to think about who does what and why they do it. We saw teachers talk about sport and play and actually do activities to make students think about the benefits of both. We saw teachers talking about fair play. We saw a teacher who allowed students to rank themselves in order to create teams. He gave them quite a bit of time to get the students to decide how to make even teams by sort of self-selecting. And again, we saw a number of examples. We didn't see these examples, but we talked to the teachers and found out there was lots of examples of teachers accessing funding to ensure that everybody could participate. And this was a really noticeable thing, in particular in the Scandinavian countries, where the principle basically is that if we are doing an activity, everybody's included. So one example was the class rode to the swimming pools, and they had to provide bikes for some students that didn't have bikes. Skiing is a big thing, and when they have ski trips, everybody goes. It might mean that some students need chairs, like wheelchairs that go on skis, and they found a way of doing that. So everybody went, and that was That was really an important principle that maybe we don't do quite so well here. So coming near the end, to summarize, teaching for social justice is about taking action on inequalities of opportunities and outcomes. It requires taking action within structures and on structures, and empowering students to be able to look for themselves and take care of themselves and each other, empowering them to take action. Why is it important at this point in time? As I said earlier, there's a strong link between inequity and well-being. HP is the ideal curriculum space, and I guess in a way it's never been more important than it is right now. And finally, we finished up with examples of 9 pedagogies for social justice, and we have captured these in a book we have published recently. The second to last strand, I guess, is so what? So what impact can a health and physical education teacher have? And a good place to turn is the social and economic determinants of health. And we can see that there are some things that a teacher can't necessarily impact on. There's some structures in society that we don't have any agency to address or agency to change. But we do have agency to educate young people. We do have agency to provide positive experiences and positive physical environments in which young people can excel and grow and develop relationships. We can provide social support. We can teach kids to become more resilient. We can talk about healthy behaviors. We can connect students to health services. In regard to gender, culture, race, and racism, we can address inequities caused by these things. In other words, we can make them explicit to the students, and we can challenge them ourselves, and we can empower students to challenge them themselves. So there are a number of things that we can do. And we do know, certainly from our experiences, that many students have changed simply because of you. We do have many of our BPE and B Sport HP students that specifically talk about their health and PE teachers and what a difference they make, how your high expectations, how your support and how your belief in them empowered them to feel like they could go to university and succeed. So in a sense, I think many of you have had an impact on some of the young people you're teaching. I really appreciate your time. Thank you very much for being here today, and I welcome any questions you may have. Nahime nui.
Excellent. Thank you, Rod. That was, so fascinating. The thing that hits me all the time is, doing the research that you have been doing by observing teachers in action. It's just all the examples you've used, the wonderful sort of set of examples, watching teachers do some really wonderful things to try and create, social justice in their classrooms.
I think one of the things it really has been a privilege to work with teachers and to observe them and to unpack some of the things they do. And I think that's one of the contributions that certainly we can make in the university, is to really provide descriptions of some of the good things and share them with other teachers, because it's easy to talk about social justice being important. As someone told me recently, it's a buzzword. But to see it in action is really fascinating. It's been wonderful to watch some of these teachers in 3 countries teach, and I'm off to see more in the next few months. So I'm excited to see more teachers.
Okay. So I invite people, if you've got any questions, comments, I can relay them on to Rod if you just put them in the Q&A. And we've got one there at the moment, Rod, from Miriam, who is thanking you and can see the possibilities for using some of those pedagogies in her own teaching of languages. So thank you, Miriam. One of the things I thought about, if we go right back to the beginning, would be just clarifying some of the use of some of the terms. So you use the word pedagogies. So how do you perceive or define that particular term?
It certainly is a term that's got a large literature base that can talk about it in different ways. When I talk about pedagogies, I'm referring to the actions of a teacher to impact on the learning of the young people in their classroom. So what a teacher does to affect learning, and that can be a number of things. It can be, how teachers organize the classroom, how the actual physical environment. It can be what they say. It can be what they do, because in a sense, as I said previously, what we model can be a really important pedagogical message to the students. It can be the clothing we wear. It can be how we relate to individuals. It can be the content we choose, or it can be how we allow students to choose content and maybe assessments. So there's a whole number of things that would be included under that umbrella of pedagogies, and pedagogical work, I guess, would be the other word that might be used.
Right. Okay. Then the other term then would be, how would you define social justice?
I've been interviewing a number of teachers recently, and I've been asking them the same question, and it's a really difficult question to answer. The first part of it is very much that it's social in the sense that it needs to be defined within the community that it's taking place. So there is no single definition of social justice. It's located in certain spaces and places. The idea of justice, as I see it, is actually it's reducing the inequities within society. And I don't think we're ever going to make the world equal. It's about making it less unequal. And there may be it's very much about making the world less unequal for people and allowing people both the opportunities, but probably more importantly, equal outcomes in terms of education, in terms of being included, in terms of opportunities to engage. So it's a difficult concept, and that's kind of how I ended up with JEDI. It was very much teachers talked about social justice as this buzzword that didn't have a clear meaning, but they could really unpack equity. They could talk about diversity. They could talk about inclusion. So that's some of the language that's come from the teachers. And so I guess we've been rolling with that in the last little while, because it seems to be language that's everyday language, and teachers can talk about what they do for those things in a slightly different way.
Okay, so I think that picks up Lisette's question there, which was, do teachers think about social justice in different ways? And what are some of the ideas that teachers have about what that term actually means to them, and perhaps in practice?
So the examples that, again, with this next study, is there's some really strong examples of, in particular, Māori culture and Māori language, and teachers including it as everyday opportunity within their teaching. There are another examples of really giving everybody an opportunity to participate in games. So long ago, John Evans said that PE makes friends and enemies. And it's very much about how maybe some of the people that didn't like PE can be included in a way that they haven't been included in the past. So thinking about including students of different abilities in different ways, and through actually, Al, this is a nice plug for you. The Move Well resource has come up a number of times in terms of designing games to include people, making them less focused on a competition and more on working together, and focusing lessons on some of those social outcomes more than on the winning and losing of games. So those are a number of examples that have come through with some of the students, or some of the teachers that I've spoken with recently.
Okay. And as Katie has said here, can you talk more about how these approaches might be enabling for diverse students, including those who identify as LGBTQI+?
That's a good question, but I think all students would we would want all students to be involved. I know that things like gender neutral toilets are happening in many schools. I think learning about gender diverse students is something that teachers need to do, in the same way that as someone that arrived in New Zealand, I knew nothing about Māori culture. And so I think it's about learning ourselves and being open to the needs of different students. And part of it is hearing the voices of those students. So providing avenues for that to happen. And one school I've talked to recently, one teacher I talked to recently talked about they have a student executive group that sort of informs the health and PE program and provides ideas to them. So I think that voice is something that needs to be included, and we need to be open to hearing that voice.
Okay. Now, Kylie's added a question here, which is, have you observed any risky pedagogies when it comes to social justice, equity agendas and HPE? You may need to define what a risky pedagogy is for you, Kylie, but I'll throw that back to Rod. This concept of risky pedagogies?
My understanding might be that if we work really hard to include students, do we make some students feel uncomfortable? Do we force relationships? I haven't seen any, but I've probably experienced them in my own teaching. And I can think of an example where I had a wonderful adventure-based learning activity. I had a student that was new to the school, and I worked really hard to include him. And the students failed in an activity, and students laughed at him, and it was an absolute disaster. So I can claim to have done some things with the best of intentions that haven't worked out. But I haven't seen any in the observations that I've had, or I haven't noticed any at least. Yeah, that, I mean, without totally understanding risky, I think that would be my answer.
Okay. There's always I suppose a concern that for some people, as the curriculum either changes, and it's debatable whether it has changed. I think the impetus and the emphasis of that curriculum has been pretty strong for the last 15 years. But for some people, when we talk like this, they could say that the physical is being taken out of physical education. What's your sort of thoughts on that in terms of being able to put more of an explicit focus on teaching for social justice?
The project we had was very much teaching for social justice in the context of what we would call physical education. All of the observations, all of the pedagogies we reported on were done in that physical context. In a sense, it really has little impact on the physical activity component of it. It might take the focus, what does take the focus a little away from actually the performance, the doing of the physical, the developing ability, but it's very much all done within that context. So in a sense, I don't think it's not meant to be a step away. But I guess we have the luxury, and I possibly didn't recognize this as much as the Scandinavian colleagues. They mentioned how good it was to have that combination of health and physical education in one curriculum area. And they were really excited by it. And the question they pushed back to me is, why aren't we looking at that? Why aren't we looking at some of the things that are happening in the classroom in addition to what's happening on the fields? And the answer was because the project was very much around something that we all did, which was that practical activity-based physical education. So it's a wonderful addition. We're really lucky to have it. But the intention of this project was not to sort of move away from practical activity. It was very much to find ways of using these in practical activities. And going back to James McIntyre's theses, one of the comments was that critical pedagogies, or teaching for social justice, was a health pedagogy, and they couldn't conceptualize how that fit into that practical environment. So that was very much partly the genesis of this project, was to think about how that could play out, how that curriculum, the objectives of the curriculum could play out in a practical context, in addition to a classroom-based context.
Okay. You identified 9 pedagogies, and I just wondered if in your experience, was there or do you think there is a pedagogy that, or a starting point that teachers would ideally come in at? You know, is there something you say, here's a good spot to start and to begin to think about?
The 9 pedagogies aren't meant to be linear necessarily. They're not meant to be something that you have to draw on one. There's overlaps between them. But I think I think caring for students is really the starting point. And when students feel like you care about them, I think it opens up lots of possibilities. Part of caring is caring for yourself as well. So one of the sort of the cautions for young teachers is you want to invest in caring for the students, but you also got to look after yourself. You need to sort of support yourself in the same way you support the students. And often it's using the support structures around you, using the senior colleagues. But that pedagogy of care to me is really, really critical. And I do think that inclusion and social cohesion are really, really important things. And I think some of the strategies we saw where lessons are explicitly about those things and being done through, perhaps playing games that exclude people and then being really clear that that's happening, and then asking the students how they can change the game so you can include people. So making the students aware and having them solve the problem. And that, I guess, incorporates 2 or 3 of those ideas. So again, they're not sort of isolated things you do. They're very much part of a package. And I guess depending on who you are, depending on the context you're teaching in, you may draw heavily on some of them, and others may not be used quite as much. And I think that's absolutely appropriate, because we know that context matters a whole lot, and your year 13 class in a small town in Invercargill will be very different than your 7 and 8 combined class in a rural school in Northland. So there are, they are hopefully tangible, pragmatic ideas that teachers can use. That was the intention, at least, and it's not a finished project. So we're still looking to spend more time learning from our teachers.
Okay. I've always had the thought that, one of the really supportive things for teachers is our curriculum, and the New Zealand, especially health and physical education, has always had a really strong critical orientation to it, and great credit to people like Ian Colpin, who was critical in writing that, and I'm just trying to think of the health writer, Gillian, who was involved in that. And Lisette asks a question here, which was, our curriculum is really strongly oriented that way. Were our colleagues that you worked with in Norway, Sweden, UK, and the US, did they have sort of similar statements in their curriculums that would support this sort of focus?
Recently, both the Norwegian and the Swedish curriculums have had a stronger orientation around social justice, although the conversations with the colleagues there were very much that social justice doesn't translate very well in those languages. So again, the words equity, inclusion are words that are more commonly used. But we certainly have had it for a much longer period of time. We have it in a very explicit way. And it's, our curriculum, if we look at even the focus on relationships is really explicit, and taking action. So there's a number of things in our curriculum. Oddly enough, in interviewing a number of teachers recently, the teachers that noticed it the most were a couple of teachers that had come from the UK and come to New Zealand. And they drew a lot more strength and a lot more focus on social justice from the curriculum, perhaps, than some of the teachers from New Zealand. Now, whether that's because they don't think about the curriculum so much because they've worked with it for a long time, I'm not entirely sure. But a couple of the teachers that were from the UK really noticed that the curriculum enabled them to move beyond sort of a sporting physical performance environment to working on things like inclusion and equity in different ways.
Okay. All right. So perhaps my last question is, so what's the next step for the project, and where are you intending to take it?
It's interesting. You're involved in an international study, and you think you're going to become really knowledgeable, but the more I get involved, the more I realize we've just scratched the surface. I'm currently speaking with teachers, interviewing teachers. So if teachers are out there and they're interested in telling me their thoughts, I'm really interested. I'm interested in more classroom observations, and we're doing that in Norway and in Spain in a few months. So again, a real privilege of the job is to be able to have those opportunities to see teachers and spend time in classrooms. And in 2023, we are planning with colleagues. I'm planning a research project where we work with teachers that have got an interest in social justice, and we get them to figure out what they would like to do and how they would like to do it and who they're targeting, and supporting them as they're doing these things. So for the next couple of years, we're really keen on working with a small number of teachers. And what we would want to do is to have those teachers then present at conferences like PENS and on webinars and talk to other teachers and share what they've done. And the second way of disseminating that would be through creating a website where we can share ideas and we can share practices. So very much really working within that HPE context over the next few years. Given my age, I've got a relatively short runway, so I think that'll keep me busy for a number of years, and I'm pretty excited about it.
Okay, and I think the thing that's worth emphasizing there is, the desire to work with teachers, and the examples that you've used are really demonstrating that teachers are already doing a lot of these things. And so the projects that I know that you're involved in are really about working alongside teachers to be able to support them, to understand their practices, and through the website to share those practices more broadly. So, and I know that you'd love to, if there's any teachers who are interested in sort of a project like that, you'd welcome any contact. Just send through an email or something like that. So that means we've got no more questions there, and so it's probably a really nice place to pause and to say thank you so much, Rod, for sharing your research today and some of the ideas that we may be able to pick up and use and being able to think about programs, high quality health and PE programs in schools. Some really valuable ideas there. So thank you so much for that. Once again, just say if anyone wants to make contact with Rod, they're more than welcome to. There's some there's an ongoing research program and support program there, so we would love to be able to make that contact. And finally, a plug for next Thursday, which is our final webinar, which is looking at games and the MoveWell resource, and really looking forward to being able to present that alongside Marissa Murakai from Physical Education New Zealand. So I hope everyone has a really nice evening. It's not very good weather out there, so it's just worth sort of tucking in and having a nice evening. And thank you very much.